Pastor Dave said, with a 4-day notice, um, which I'm happy to do. But sometimes there is that old proverb, and I will explain this in a second. There is that old proverb that says, familiarity breeds contempt. That is, it sounds terrible, right? But the idea behind it is that we become so familiar, we become so accustomed to certain things, right, that we don't think about it anymore. Not that we're contemptuous about it, but that we just don't think about it. And so we take things for granted, okay? And part of that is not entirely a bad thing, but sometimes we have to rethink. And when something becomes really familiar to us and we take it for granted, we, not always, but sometimes we don't go back and look at the text, and we don't go back and look at the context, and we don't revisit certain things. So, for example, because we're dealing with the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it has become almost acceptable among many, not us here because we're enlightened, but for many out there, it's become acceptable that the fruit in Genesis is, of course, what fruit? The apple, except for one slight problem. There is no apple in the text. I mean, it doesn't exist. Or, we may speak about the whale, right, that swallowed Jonah. Except, of course, there is no whale in the text. But when we revisit, we sort of we begin to think about things in their context. So, as a reminder, the book of Ruth, as an example, and the way the Bible is put together is a reminder. The book of Ruth begins with the phrase, in the days when the judges ruled. And particularly, ancient scholars who are putting together the canon, the canon with one N, right, are thinking, where do we place this book? And so naturally, they place the book next to the book of Judges. Now, if you read the book of Judges and you read the book of Ruth, you realize they have how much in common? Nothing, right? But of course, it makes sense because it says, in the days when the judges ruled, it has to be, right? But that's following that's following the Greek. That's following the Septuagint. The Septuagint? And this is sort of the most well-known, the earliest translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And it's called the Septuagint, as you can tell from our Roman letters up there. It has to do with what? 70, right? And it's called the Septuagint because it is believed that 70 of the elders translated. By the way, could it have been 69 or 71? Who knows, right? Doesn't matter. Okay, and that's generally the way it is written. And our English canon follows this instead of the Hebrew. If you looked at the Hebrew Bible, which, by the way, you may, I don't control it, you may do that. But if you would like me to tell you, it doesn't have to do anything with the book of Judges. It's right after the Song of Solomon, for example. Okay, it's very different. In fact, the last book in the Hebrew Old Testament, in the English Old Testament, is the book of Malachi. In the Hebrew, this is the tougher one, Chronicles. Okay, it's all over the place. All right, except of course with the Torah, which has the. So when we begin with the book of Ruth, we want to at least place it in context. And this is a book that focuses on qualities that, in my estimation, are universal qualities. Qualities of kindness, qualities of care, qualities of compassion. We know what care means, right? As in, from the Latin. Okay? We also get our word what? charity from it. And it's from caritas, that means what? Love. That's what the word means, right? That's what charity means. The King James Version used in 1 Corinthians 13 talks about hope, right? What? The greatest of these is, except in the King James, it says what? Charity, all right? This is not about giving, right? This is about the core of the human existence, love. So it deals with that. It deals with compassion, which we use regularly. And I'm not saying that we should always be parsing words, but occasionally we should. And the word means literally to. We used to speak about the passion of Christ, which is now often referred to that Sunday as Palm Sunday, right? But passion has to do, literally means what? Suffering. And so compassion is to enter into the suffering of another. Generally, we don't speak of having compassion about someone who has just won the lottery or is giddy or is happy, right? It's always someone who needs care, who is in pain, who is in grief. That's what it means. So the book deals with all of those. The book also deals with something that in our society, in this time, in this place, in these circumstances, is really, really, really important. And that is, how do we treat and care for the outsider? For one who is a refugee. These are not contemporary ideas that somehow in our day and age have emerged as something we have to deal with. These are ancient ideas based on principles that we believe are essential for who we are. So the book of Ruth deals with this in a couple of different ways, both as Naomi, as we will discover, and her husband, Elimelech, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, enter, and also about Naomi and Ruth as they return. And in both instances, we have to deal with what does it mean to open our arms to those who are from the outside. So we begin with the book of Ruth, and as we have done in the past, I will read to you the opening 5 verses. In the days when the judges ruled, we already talked about that, right? There was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab. And by the way, I want for us, I know you're doing this, but sometimes as a professor, part of my role is to emphasize what is also self-evident, okay, or should be. So look at the details here. There's no quiz here afterwards, but look at the details. Okay. A man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. Okay. And the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons or her husband. Now, by the way, I'm assuming there are a number of things that strike us, but anything that immediately leaps off the first 5 verses for you? There's a lot of death in the first 5 verses. But not just a lot of death. A lot of death of whom? Oh, by the way, if you want a story about women, you need to kill the men off in the 5 first verses, okay? One guy's going to show up later, and he has an important role, Boaz. But for now, we really don't need Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion. And the way to really focus this story on the women, they just died, right? And for those of us who want details of the story, too bad. They died. I will tell you right now, it doesn't come back at the end, they all live happily ever after chapter 4. They just died. They're gone. So now, but also look at the pronouns that are used. All right? And so this is not just going into the weeds. This is simply emphasizing something that's important. When the decision is made to go to Moab, whose decision is this? Elimelech. And it is his wife, and it is his sons. All right? That's simply the environment. This is not, this is the way it is. But when they die, look what happens. You see the change? It's what? Her. The focus shifts to Naomi. And she is left without her 2 sons or her husband. Why is this a big deal? A woman's identity in those days within the nature of the society, which of course is profoundly patriarchal, right? Is the woman's identity is shaped, at least in part, by 3 men. 1, father, husband, son. What do we have here? None of the above. And we have 2 widows. 1 evidently elderly, and 1 younger, 1 a mother-in-law, and 1 a daughter-in-law. And that's the end of the first 5 verses. And so if we had a pause on that story, we would legitimately be left to wonder what in the world could possibly happen and come out of this. Can anything good come out of this? By the way, does that phrase sound familiar? Right? Right. But something good will come out. One other thing here by way of setting the context. Moab. What do we know about Moab? I'm glad you asked. Moab is one of those countries that the Israelites were told, do not enter Moab. Don't even go close to Moab. Now, you might be thinking, Hemchan, stop making stuff up. Okay? Which I could do, by the way, except not in this case. They were told. And the reason you shouldn't go into Moab is very, very straightforward. It is because that is enemy territory. So don't go there. But here is the dilemma. In a time when there is famine, from a place that is called Bethlehem, which of course we know, right? And we should know more about Bethlehem these days because we should always know about this, but certainly within the geography of the place, right? And we don't want to overlook the meaning of this word. And if it sounds familiar, and it should be because, of course, Bethlehem. And we should know it because we know a whole series of words that begin with Beth, right? Not only because it's a woman's name, right? But the word Beth, as in Bethel. Same word, right? Bethel, okay, same word. The word means house. That's what the word means in Hebrew, house. And so Bethel literally means house of God, as in El. El is a shortened Hebrew word from the Hebrew Elohim. That's what it means. Beth El. Okay? Gabriel. All of those El words means God. Bethlehem. Lechem is not one that is familiar to many of us. And Lechem simply means bread. So here you have Elimelech, Naomi, and their two sons leaving the land of bread because of a famine. And you can see the irony here, right? You're leaving the land of plenty to go to because now there's a famine. And this is not an artificial, sometimes in this society I have to say, sometimes because we are a land of plenty. By the way, if we don't think in this land we are a land of plenty, we have not been attentive. We are. But sometimes even in a land of plenty, there are some who actually emphasize that everything is scarce. And therefore, I must keep things to myself. So they leave the land of bread, called a house of bread, so that they can go into enemy territory so that they can have food. Because sometimes in the face of death, we make difficult choices to go into places that we were told we shouldn't, simply to survive. But then look what happens. And this is the remarkable thing. Okay. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered for his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her two daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. So after 10 years, loss of a husband, loss of her two sons-in-law, okay, now you have here a mother-in-law with two daughters-in-law. The mother-in-law is in, quote, a foreign land, and the two daughters-in-law are Moabite women. And all are widows. By any definition, we would think on the surface, this is a crisis. What do you do here? And what Naomi sets out to do is nothing short of extraordinary. She has decided, because now the word is out, that there is now food in in Judah. So let's go back. She is about to go back. That's home. That's home. And so she says to her two daughters-in-law, but Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband. And then they kissed. She kissed them, and they wept aloud. Naomi is about to make an extraordinary sacrificial decision here. She has decided, I'm going to go back to Judah. I'm elderly. You are home. You're at home here. Go back to your mother's house. Okay? Your Moabite women. This is your home. Okay? And then she kissed them. And they wept. Sometimes, I know many of us in this society, particularly in times of grief and pain, we are tempted to say, I know how you feel. I'll speak for myself. I'm very, 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 that's a triple very here now, reluctant to say, I know how you feel. Because I am not so sure that I can fully ever understand how you feel. even if we have things in common. Even if the grief that you bear is one that I myself might have experienced somewhere in. So we may have, our lives might intersect at certain places. But we want to be careful to say, we know how you feel. What we may be able to do is, like the friends of Job, to begin with, by the way, sit around for 7 days in the ash dump and be quiet. Okay? The moment they started speaking, you know what happens, right? It was a disaster. But this is Naomi's decision to go back. I have nothing to offer you. She kissed them and they wept. But we can begin to feel the pathos. We can begin to feel sort of the shared grief of these women, not knowing what do we do now. And once again, the story could end there. Naomi goes back to what was home. Orpah and Ruth remain in Moab. And we go on to read another book. But it doesn't end there. They said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. We're not staying here. We're going with you. It's a remarkable thing. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Can you feel the transition here? Right? Yes, it's not as if somehow daughters-in-law were, quote, as the sometimes phrase suggests, legally in law. Now, my daughters, go back. They said, no, we're going with you. And she said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? And then she said something, a couple of things here, that on the surface seems or might seem really strange. She says, do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? And you're thinking, huh? What are you talking about? Oh, we have this moment here about staying or going back, and now you're telling me about having sons in your womb? Naomi, wake up. But she's onto something. Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I'm too old to have a husband. Once again, you can begin to see Ruth and Orpah thinking, I don't think we're connecting here, mother-in-law. Except there is something at work here. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? And again, you're wondering, what are you talking about? But we know what she's talking about. Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me. Then they wept aloud, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. I know in the Bible in general, there are moments that are so profoundly moving and poignant. This is right up there. Right? These are these three women trying to find out, what will our lives be? What will our lives be? What will we do? And one is saying, go back, stay home, go back to your mother's home. And the two women say, no, we want to come with you. And finally, Orpah decides that she's going to stay. And this time, she kisses Ruth. They wept. But she kisses Naomi, but Ruth clung to Naomi. And not everyone likes this moment. And I'll give you an example. This is, if you were reading a text on Ruth, this probably would be in the footnote. Okay? And I have to tell you as an aside, I love footnotes. Okay? It always strikes me as being a mine of information. Good footnotes. There's one scholar, happens to be a Jewish scholar, a couple centuries ago, writing about this story, and said what Orpah did was so awful, right? So terrible. And compare her actions to dogs. I mean, I do not know why we pick on dogs, by the way. There's a lot of picking on dogs. But Ruth clung to her. When you hear the image of cling, as in clung, what image comes to mind? This is not an Old Testament or Hebrew question. This is just like every ordinary, everyday question. When you think of clinging, you think of what? A child? Don't leave me? Hold tight? A spider web? A desperate situation? Does it always have to be a desperate situation? No. I mean, you can imagine a kid hanging onto your pants, as you're walking away, thinking, oh, we're getting further and further away from the ice cream store, But a weaving. But here's the thing. This is not negative. There is nothing about this that is negative. The Hebrew word that is used there just for our sake is the word pronounced dabach. Okay? And what it means, if you take it totally out of context, just on the basis of the meaning of the word, it means to stay close to. This word is used several times in the book of Ruth. And what Ruth has decided to do is to stay close to Naomi. She is not going to leave her. She is simply not going to leave her. And so while Orpah goes back, by the way, you know that Oprah Winfrey person is named for this person, and the letters are transposed as the story goes. She writes about it. Her name should have been Orpah. So now begins the journey of Ruth and Naomi, and we have to see what will happen. Ruth clung to her, and in the next, absolutely, in my view, beautiful moment of transformation and sacrifice, we have almost like a song of Ruth, if there is such a thing. Okay? It's gorgeous. The translation that is used here, which I've been consistent with, is a translation that comes from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Okay? There is no perfect translation, by the way. If someone wants to sell you a perfect translation, you know what, right? Hang on to your wallet and walk away. That animal doesn't exist. But we have really, really excellent translations out there. Often, again, with footnotes, it says it could be this or it could be that as well, depending which translation you're using, Greek or Hebrew or Syriac or whatever the case might be. So she said, this is Naomi, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law, that is, do what she's doing. Ruth, essentially, I appreciate the sacrifice that you're making on my behalf, but follow the lead of your sister, of Orpah, your sister-in-law. But Ruth said to her, and I'm going to use the old line here, okay, this opening line. The opening line of what Ruth says to her, do not press me to leave you, which is absolutely a fine translation. The older translation begins with entreat me not to leave you. It's one of the more beautiful expressions, right? Uh, when it says, don't press me to leave you, I mean, it's so prosaic. Okay. But when it begins, entreat me not to leave you. By the way, if you say that to someone, they are not going to leave you. If you say, don't press me, right? They may very well leave you. I mean, it doesn't help. And Ruth says, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following you. And then she makes these absolutely dramatic, what I would call transformations in her life in this moment. And she says, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. I mean, this is remarkable. I'm willing to give up my land and my people. I'm willing to give up whatever belief system. Sometimes we think that there is only one God, the Lord of, right? But the Old Testament makes it very clear, repeatedly, that there were many gods around, right? And we know that the Hebrew word that we sometimes use for God is actually a plural word. It's the masculine plural word Elohim. By the way, we can't get around it. So even though we translated God, the Hebrew means gods, right? But contextually, we translated God. And there is no sort of getting around, well, it all depends. There is no all depends here. It's a masculine plural word that means gods, Elohim. And I am, is the masculine plural in Hebrew. So a lot of words that we sometimes add S to it, a word of caution, don't. The word cherubim is already plural. There is no such thing as cherubims or seraphims. Okay? It's plural. So it says here, I'm willing to entirely change my identity for you. Don't ask me to leave you. I can't leave you. I will come close to you. I will stick by you. I will give up my people. I will give up my land. I will give up my beliefs, and I will be with you. When you make, remember a couple of weeks ago last week we were talking about vows? When you make such a vow, when you pronounce such a promise, what is Naomi going to say? Oh, would you stop? No. And Naomi says, so Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley season. And now we know that there is food, right? Now we know because, of course, the barley season has begun. Now, so Ruth clung to her, and these two widows, one elderly, presumably, one younger, they have come back. One is coming home after a while. If you have ever read anything by Thomas Wolfe, right, you will know famously among many things, and he has written thousands of pages, right? So what I'm about to do is a disgrace, and I will admit it. But one of his famous lines is, you can go home again. Okay? And so Ruth and Naomi is coming home again. And things change, of course. It's been a decade, but she's coming home again. So if Thomas Wolfe is right, that you can go home again, think of the challenges, right? When I came to this country as a young student, not knowing what I was getting into, by the way, I had no idea. And no one told me, for example, that coming to Minnesota, from the tropics was just really not wise. But that's where I went. And that might explain why, to the day, I will always be a Minnesota Vikings fan, just for the record. But I came, and I discovered some things, that a coat, for example, would be necessary in October, or September, or May. But life went on and adjusted, and it was home. And after graduation, for the first time, I went back to where I grew up. It was only 3 years later, after I had graduated in 3 years. And I met my mother, who was there, and she looked at me and she said, what would a mother say to you, not having seen you for 3 years as you have returned from far away with your degree or whatever? You're too thin, by the way, which was to begin with, right? And she looks at me and she says, what's with the mustache? The hugs will come later, but what's this one? Everything changes. Even as I went into the country, I realized everything, not everything, so much has changed. Because in a way, you can't go home again. But Ruth is heading home, and in tow with a foreign daughter-in-law. And remember, there are no men in their lives. And now, the one thing we know, it's the barley season. So here we go. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? And she said to them, call me no longer Naomi. By the way, the Hebrew word Naomi is beautiful, means that which is sweet. It means sweetness is what it means, that which is sweet. Call me no longer Naomi, call me Mara. You can see where this is drifting. Mara means bitter, okay? Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty, Hebrew here is Shaddai, what we often speak of El Shaddai, okay? For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me? And the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. So, question. Naomi went to Moab, she said, full. Right? Meaning what? Husband and 2 sons, Jeanette. 2 sons, right? A husband and 2 sons. But now I've come back empty. Except for one. I mean, you do have, if I might make a case here for Ruth, you know. So I'm standing next to you, and the women are out there, you know, they are stirred. And I love that word, right? This is not something that it comes out of kind of like an intellectual stirring. This is not an academic. This is not a cerebral. This is not a mind. It comes from the heart, to be stirred, to be moved. And the women are saying, is this Naomi? And we don't know the details there. 10 years, maybe in a foreign land, you know, may cause us to look, well, in any land may cause us to look different, right? Is this Naomi? And she's saying, don't call me Naomi. But Ruth is with her. Ruth is right there with her. Yes, it is a reminder that when you left and you said you left full, you're talking about what society expects. A husband and sons. and you've come back empty. Except, of course, you have a daughter-in-law who has just entirely transformed her identity for your sake. You have not really come back empty. You've come back empty only on the basis of what culture and tradition dictates as emptiness. But Ruth is by your side. And then there are some details in the story that we never heard about before. And here it is. So Naomi returned together with Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, and a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. New information here. We didn't know that existed before, and we will discover there is more. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I might find favor." And she said, that is Naomi, "Go, my daughter." So she went. And we begin to see, we begin to see the women taking the initiative for their own identity. They do not come back to Bethlehem. By the way, again, you notice, the story does not say where they return to, where they're living. We just know that they have returned, or Naomi has returned with her daughter-in-law, and the daughter-in-law, Ruth, said, I got to do something here. We already have Boaz's introduction into the story, so we know he will play a role. But it's the women who decide that we will do something. And Ruth said, "Shall I go out?" Think how dramatic this is. "Shall I go out?" And Naomi says, "Yes." And so she went. Now, I want to focus just for a minute on gleaning. What's this gleaning thing? Pick up of leftovers. Do we have gleaning here? At all, still? The birds. It's kind of a nice connection here with St. Francis. Dogs? Who else gleans? Do you know who else gleans still to this day? And sometimes migrant workers. And let me give you an example. Before the time came, as some of you know, and I left, and I went to Britain to begin my PhD. That summer, I was with some friends up in, Minnesota. One of whom was a farmer, potato farmer, big potato farmer, okay, about which, let me confess right now, I know nothing, okay? The closest I've come to a farm is, dirt. That's it. But that summer, Bruce said, "Why don't you come out with me on the tractor?" And I said, "Sure." And I went, and it was harvest. He was harvesting potatoes. And he is sitting in his cabin, and he said, "Hemchan, I want you to stand here, and you will see the potatoes coming across this conveyor belt," is what I call it, right? And he said, "What I want you to do is to look at as the potatoes come, and if you see any that is rotten or, bad, toss it off. That's it. That's it. I can do this." So as this is happening, I noticed something, what I consider strange. As the potatoes are coming, there are some small potatoes that are falling between the slots. And I have to tell you, a little bit of a panic set in. For me, I'm thinking, I'm really messing this up. So I called out to Bruce, finally, who heard me in his air-conditioned cabin. I'm not resentful or anything that I'm standing in the sun at 90 degrees on a conveyor belt, but I called out to him, and I said, Bruce, you're losing your potatoes. And Bruce says to me, that's supposed to happen. And what he said is that those small potatoes which are still good, once the harvest is over, folks will come and pick them up. It's a remarkable thing. This is not something that was created in northern Minnesota. This is an ancient idea from the book of Deuteronomy, and now we see it in Ruth. That I'm going to go into the field. I'm not asking you to let me take part of your, harvest. I just want to pick up the leftovers. That's all I want. And this is within the tradition. This is within the sacred text that you have. She said, that's what I'm going to do. And so she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. By the way, imagine this. This is the phrase even in our liturgy, right? We use, the Lord be with you. And also with you, let us pray. This is very common. And this is how Boaz greets his reapers. Could you imagine this? Imagine the construction site, and I am the owner, and I'm calling out to my manager, and the Lord be with you. And they will look at me like, what are you talking about? But that's what Boaz does. They answered, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, here's the language, right? To whom does this young woman belong? That's the language of what? Language of ownership and property. To whom does this young woman belong? This is not a language that, oh, hello, I don't think we have met. I'm Boaz and you are Ruth. Nice to meet you. Tell me about yourself. It says, essentially, who owns you? To whom do you belong? Do we ever use that language anymore, by the way? It's a trick question. Do we ever use that language? I'm mine, I'm yours, Is this a confession or is this just want to be sure. I mean, in the right place if it is, of course. We do, don't we? Most notably. Is this your husband? But even more so, right? I know we don't want to hear this, but I mean, in some, still, the tradition, for example, in marriage, right? As the bride is coming down the aisle, typically with her father, not always, but typically, and the pastor or the priest stands up there and from time to time, not always anymore, says, who gives this woman, and who gives this woman to whom? Another guy, right? Don't get me wrong, I'm just relating stuff. We still have it, right? We still have it. And we'll get back to the whole marriage thing when we talk about the best man in a second. To whom does this belong? The servant who was in charge of the reaper says, she is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now without resting even for a moment. By the way, we don't know what that word in Hebrew means. Okay, the context essentially says, I've been on my feet forever, right? I haven't rested. And then Boaz, and we want to look at the language here. Then Boaz says to Ruth, now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or to leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Now, of course, we know keeping close has to do with what? It's the same word as what? Cling. Remember we met cling earlier? When we were told that Ruth clung to Naomi? Same word here. But notice, even though it's the same word, it's translated differently, right? Again, the context dictates this. And remember when we were talking, some of us may recall, if you were here, when we were talking about the Hebrew prophets, seems like an eternity ago, and I mentioned that there's certain words like in Hebrew, the Hebrew word for justice and the Hebrew word for righteousness. In English, in the New Revised Standard Version, I think we have 12 different translations of the one word. You know, from innocent to righteous to acquit, very, very different, right? But it all depends on the context in which the word is used. Here, stay close, right? Don't leave the side of the women. And this is remarkable. Listen, my daughter, stay here, keep close to the young women, right? And there's a warning that something that's being reaped, and follow them. And then here's a great line. I have ordered the young women not to bother you. Guys, I know she's new. Don't even think about it. Okay? I have told the young men who are reaping here, do not, whatever. The language is a little stronger than bother. This is not going up to them and says, oh, hello, my name is Emmanuel. No. Do not, because she's an outsider, do not bug her, right? Do not abuse her. And then he says, if you get hungry, go to the vessels, drink from the young men, what the young men. Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me when I'm a foreigner? She is absolutely deeply moved by this. Because the idea at the time, and quite often today, is the idea that if you are an outsider, if you are a foreigner,